Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to essentially, we have this now whole thing on the Federalist Papers, and I'm excited to have Dr. Beienberg back with us. And I'm actually really excited to talk about Federalist 39 because, again, if you've been listening, I was an AP Gov teacher for a while. And so we did, 10, 51, 70, 78. And 39 is not one that I am familiar with. So Dr. Beienberg, can you kind of help us understand what was the main idea of Federalist number 39?
Federalist 39, I'm excited to do this because Federalist 39 might be my favorite of the Federalist Papers. There's a little sort of with a piece of something from Federalist 45 that are often paired together. So Federalist 39 has, I would say, sort of two main ideas. The one that I think is the more important that I'll spend the most time on, but I would be negligent if I didn't at least nod to the first one. So the first third or so of that paper is a defense that the Constitution is a Republican government. And Madison, you can see, is a little prickly about this argument because he thinks it's he seemingly thinks this is kind of a dumb argument that he even has to answer this. But he effectively says, yes, it's a Republican form of government, which we all agree is what we want. We're not a monarchy. We're not an aristocracy. We are a republic. And he goes through and basically says, and what do we all pretty much agree means a republic? Well, that if, it's not a direct democracy, we're not taking a massive poll on every issue. But he says basically the core of a republic is that all of the offices are filled either directly or indirectly by the people and from the people, right? So yes, he says, the judges, no one's voting for the judges, but you're at least voting for somebody who votes for somebody who votes for the judges, right? So he says at the end of the day, look at this entire institution. There's nothing in here that's hereditary. Everything, except for the judges, which he says, and you probably want these as life tenure, but everybody except for them is on fixed terms. They can be removed. Everybody can either be impeached or voted out of office or kicked out of office, so that the people ultimately maintain, if not at the sort of micro level of managing every particular policy, they are able to choose the broad contours of their political society. So he goes into that a little bit more, but that's basically the core of his case. It's like, yes, this is obviously a Republican form of government. All of these positions, somebody voted for either the person in office or the person who voted for the person in office. We are not absolute France. Knock it off. Then the core of the Federalist 39 is a discussion about the institutional arrangements of the division of power between the central government and the state governments. And this is part of why the term Federalist Papers, federalism, there's some overlap among these terms. And I know students get very easily confused on this, and then the party as well. But a little bit of, and I'll try not to be too political science-y about this, but the fundamental division between two kinds of governments are what would be called a federal government, which doesn't just mean central. Federal means that it is basically power is decentralized and divided, with primary authority lying with the lower levels of power. So in this case, the states. In Canada, it would be the provinces. In Mexico, it's going to be states. But federal means that basically presumptive power lies with the lower ranking units. Okay. By contrast, political scientists would call it unitary. Madison uses the term national, but this is a government in which power starts at the top with whatever the central government is, and they hand power down to the lower units. So fundamentally, federal, sort of bottom up, the bottom builds the top. In national or unitary, the top builds the bottom. And basically everybody recognizes that they want a federal government in the United States. This is what the Articles of Confederation was. There is very little appetite for switching to a unitary government because from their perspective, that was one of the problems with the British Empire. We don't want that. But we recognize that we've tilted too far toward federal, so we need to push in a couple of places toward more national. Not because national is inherently better, but Federalist 39 is a sort of piece-by-piece argument where Madison says, these are the advantages of federal, these are the advantages of national. Let's combine them in ways that might look weird, but will actually give us the best of both worlds. And so he says, is this a federal government? Is this a national government? He says it's fundamentally parts of both. And let's get the best parts of both. And so he says, for example, in terms of the scope of the powers of this federal government, he says it is fundamentally federal. Why? Because the only powers that can be exercised by the United States government are those which are specifically enumerated to it by the U.S. Constitution. All the other powers remain with the state government. So he says
and enumerated specifically means they are listed. Like
yes, they're
right
spelled
there.
out.
Okay.
Congress shall have the power to do X. Article 1, Section 8 is most of the list, but basically Congress has the power to do X. You don't have to say the state has the power to do X. The state can do it unless you've told them no under a federal system. So the scope of the powers are federal. Feds can only do what the states have given them authority to do. Conversely, though, Madison says, the execution of the powers is national because no longer, and this is arguably the most important shift from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution. It's still federal, but its execution is now national. The federal law is now implemented by a federal executive and adjudicated in a federal court system, rather than before or in a pure federal system where the central government says, states, please execute our law for us. Mm-hmm. So you can see it's not quite the right analogy, but you can see an analogy of this with, say, the United Nations, right? The United Nations can't just straight up say this is happening. Mm-hmm. They make a sort of request or demand of the nations in this case. So in this case, with the execution of federal law, the U.S. government can now execute its own law. That's national. So Madison says this gives you the best of both worlds because you don't have to fear this federal government is going to be micromanaging your life or doing all sorts of things. But when we have decided that we want the federal government to have a power by giving it that constitutional authority, we can cut out the middleman of having the states then execute the law and have their own sort of incentives. Oh, well, we'd love to spend money on that, but we got potholes, right? Like, no, it executes itself. So the scope is federal, the execution is national. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on and works through the various institutions of the United States government to make sort of a similar analysis. So he says, okay, the legislative branch is the most important part of any Republican government. How is it allocated? And he says, well, we have one House, the Senate, that is selected by the states. That's how it would be in a federal government. Suriname and the United States and Canada and Libya all have the exact same numbers of votes in the United Nations, which again, it's a treaty, so it's not quite the same, but it functionally is an illustration of this. It doesn't matter how big or important you are. In a federal system, everybody gets sort of the same influence because you're treated as the relevant unit is that sovereignty. So he says that looks federal. On the other hand, the way that we're allocating the House of Representatives is divided by the entire population of the United States, broadly speaking. And that, he says, looks national. So the British would look at this and say, this is crazy. You can't have this this theoretically messy system. And Madison says, why not? We get the advantages of both. So there are legislative chambers. One house is federal. One house is he says national. Again, we would say unitary. Okay. Then says, let's look at the president. It's the same thing. The Electoral College is allocated by a mix of the number of the House plus the number of the Senate. So it is literally divided in terms of how it's allocated by this same sort of mixed system. The constitutional amendment process. Generally, stuff will be proposed by Congress, but then it has to be approved by the state. That's how it would be federal. So that system is mixed, although he notes that there is also the way just to go straight through state to state, where the state proposes and then the states ratify. But or not, he doesn't say that explicitly there, but that's part of the process. But the amendment process is mixed. And then he says, and how do we ratify this Constitution? It's federal. No state can be forced to participate. Rhode Island can go be its own little independent country, even though all the states around it have ratified it. So no one is forced to participate in this. So Federalist 39, I would say, there's a couple little punchier quotes in like Federalist 45 that we'll talk about with the federalism podcast later. But Federalist 39, I would say, is the clearest and most thorough and most systematic explanation of the ways in which the United States government is not a purely federal system. It's not a purely national system. It's a mixture. And I would say from the perspective of today's politics, and it shows the importance of the United States being at least a partly federal system rather than a purely unitary or national one.
All of that is in Federalist 39. I mean, that's quite an argument by Madison. And can I ask, we know for sure that Madison wrote this, because I know that some of the Federalist papers we're not really sure, but some of them we know for a fact that they wrote them. Dr. Beienberg, again, thank you so much for that explanation. I know you said a little bit more political science, but again, it describes why we are who we are. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.